Hi guys, here's a question. Have you ever stood before a human creation that seems to defy nature and wondered how it could possibly exist? Or asked yourself what sheer stubbornness of spirit it must have taken to create the impossible? I don't mean to sound full of myself, but I sometimes ask those same questions when I look at the masterpiece I managed to create. But who am I? Most people call me Filippo Brunelleschi, and I built the great dome that crowns the skyline of Florence. I wonder how it did it. Stay with me, because tonight I'll reveal how the impossible became reality. Not just the bricks and mortar, but the mistakes, the struggles, and the dream that never died. But before we jump into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're tuning in from, and which figure from Italy's fascinating history inspires you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and perhaps their stories will be told in a future episode. Now that everything's settled, it's time to relax. Dim the lights. Let the world's noise fade, and come with me as we journey back through time. I was not born to build. I was born to argue. That was the path laid out for me. My father was a notary, a man of the law. His world was one of ink-stained fingers, of parchment scrolls, of carefully chosen words that could bind men to agreements, or set them against one another. The future my parents saw for me was in those same scrolls, in that same tradition of debate and documentation. It was a respectable life, a safe life. But my hands did not want to hold a quill. They wanted to feel the grain of wood, the cool resistance of metal, the pliability of warm wax. While my father spoke of legal precedents, my mind was tracing the lines of the buildings we passed in the street. I would stare at the way a doorway was arched, at how the roof met the walls, at the subtle curve of a stone step worn smooth by centuries of feet. I saw not just objects, but the structure that held them together. I saw the hidden logic of form. This pull toward creation, not argument, was a quiet rebellion. It wasn't a loud defiance, but a slow, steady turning away from a world of abstraction toward a world I could touch and shape. The breakthrough came when I was apprenticed to a goldsmith. Suddenly I was surrounded not by words, but by things. I learned the weight of a hammer, the precise angle needed to make a clean cut, the patience required to solder two tiny pieces of silver together without melting the whole. But the most important lesson of all was learning to grasp scale. A goldsmith works in miniature. Every millimetre matters. An error the width of a hair could ruin a delicate clasp. This intense focus on tiny perfection taught me an exactness of eye and hand that would later become everything. I learned to think in 3 dimensions, to see not just the surface of an object, but the hidden supports, the balance of forces, the internal logic that allowed it to stand, to function, to be beautiful and strong. Florence itself was my other teacher. Our city was a workshop, always building, always creating. The sound of chisels on stone was the sound of the city breathing. I would walk through the piazzas and see the artisans at their work, and I understood that this making was the true heart of the place. The law was just the frame around the painting. I knew I had to be part of the painting itself. My family saw a diversion, a hobby, but I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the stones in our cathedral's foundation, that this was not a diversion. This was my life. The law dealt with problems between men. I wanted to solve problems of space, of weight, of form. I wanted to make things that would last. That confidence in my hands was about to be tested in the most public way imaginable. The city announced a competition. The baptistery, that beautiful octagonal building facing our cathedral, needed new bronze doors. They were to be a masterpiece, telling stories from the Bible in gleaming metal for all to see. This was not just a competition. It was a chance to define the face of Florence for generations. All who carried talent and ambition, artists, sculptors, dreamers, felt the pull of it, myself included. I remember the feeling, a clean and sharp excitement. This was my moment to step out of the workshop and into the light. I saw the doors not as a series of panels, but as a single, grand story. My design was a new vision. I wanted the figures to have life, to twist and turn with real emotion, to exist in a space that felt deep and real. I spent months on the model, pouring everything I had learned about form and composition into that single piece of wax. It felt alive in my hands. It felt true. The day of the judgment arrived. The air was thick with anticipation. All the models were displayed. I looked at the others, and I saw skill, yes, but I also saw the old ways of thinking. Flat figures, simple storytelling. Then I looked at mine, and I saw the future. I felt a quiet certainty. The judges, the wealthy merchants and guildmasters of the Wool Guild, they walked among us. They stopped. They looked. They murmured. I watched their faces as they studied my work, and I saw something I took for recognition. I thought they saw it too. Then they announced the winner, Lorenzo Ghiberti. The sound of his name was like a physical blow. It didn't feel real at first. There must be some mistake. They called us both forward. They praised my work. They called it bold and innovative. But they said his was more safe, more manageable, less of a risk. They said our designs were so equal in merit that we should work on it together. The humiliation of that offer was worse than the loss. To have my vision diluted, to have to compromise with the man whose work they deemed merely equal to mine, it was unthinkable. I refused. I told them the commission should be entirely his if he was the winner. Let him have it. Let him have the glory. I walked away from that piazza, and with every step, I felt the future I had imagined for myself crumbling into dust. The confidence I had in my own talent felt like a lie I had told myself. The city I loved felt like a different place, a place that could not see what was right in front of it. The noise of Florence faded into a dull roar in my ears. I had given them something new, something born from a deeper understanding, and they had chosen the familiar. They had chosen what was easy. The world did not end when I walked away from the piazza. The sun still rose over the rooftops of Florence the next morning. The cart still rumbled through the cobblestone streets. Life continued, but my place in it had vanished. The defeat was not a simple end. It was a violent redirection, a shoving of my life onto a path I had not chosen and could not yet see. For weeks, I moved through the city like a ghost. I would pass the workshop where Ghiberti and his team were already beginning their work on the doors, the sound of their hammers a constant mocking reminder of my failure. I avoided my old friends in the Goldsmiths' Guild. Their well-meaning words of consolation felt like pity, and pity was a poison I could not swallow. The ambition that had once burned so brightly now felt like a cold, heavy ash in my chest. I had been so certain. I had staked my entire identity on my skill, on my eye, and that certainty had been broken. I tried to return to smaller projects, to take on private commissions for reliquaries and ceremonial pieces, but my heart wasn't in it. My hands, which had always felt so sure, now felt clumsy and doubtful. I would look at a piece of silver and see not its potential, but only the memory of the bronze that was not mine to shape. The problem wasn't the metal itself. The problem was the scale of my ambition. I had aimed for the grander stage in Florence, and I had missed. Working on small, precious things for private patrons now felt like a confinement, a shrinking of my world to a size I could no longer bear. This was the crucial turning point, though I did not know it then. The anger that simmered inside me at the judges, at Ghiberti, at the entire city, began to transform. It did not cool into bitterness. Instead, it heated into a new kind of curiosity, a quiet, determined, and utterly relentless questioning. If my path was not to be in figures cast in metal, then what was it? The competition had shown me the limits of one art form. It had shown me that creating beautiful objects was not enough if the world was not ready to see their beauty. I needed to build something that could not be ignored, something that could not be dismissed as too bold or too risky, because its necessity would be undeniable. I started to walk the city again, but now I looked at it with different eyes. I wasn't looking at the decorative details on the facades of palaces. I was looking past the surface. I was looking at the bones of the city. I studied the way the Ponte Vecchio spanned the Arno, how its arches distributed the weight of the shops and the people crossing it. I looked at the thick defensive walls that surrounded Florence, considering not their history but their engineering, how they stood against siege engines and time. I would stand in the shadow of the great unfinished cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, and stare up at the massive gaping hole in its roof. For over a century it had waited for a solution. It was the city's greatest shame and its most obvious failure. And a thought, slow and patient, began to form in the quiet space where my ambition for sculpture had once lived. This was not a problem of art. This was a problem of physics. It was a puzzle of weight and counterweight, of thrust and support. It was a question of how to make stone and brick defy gravity and soar. The judges for the baptistry doors were merchants and politicians. They could be swayed by fashion and favour. But gravity is not a judge. It is a law. It does not play favourites. It does not care about your reputation. It only answers to a solution that is true. I realised then that I had been speaking the wrong language to the wrong audience. I needed to stop trying to convince men of my artistry and start conversing with the immutable laws of the natural world. My defeat in the competition became the fuel for this new pursuit. The humiliation was a fire that burned away my earlier vanity, leaving behind a purer, harder purpose. I was no longer just an artist who had lost a contest. I was an engineer who had found a problem, and this problem, the impossible dome, would not be solved by beautiful figures in bronze. It would be solved by numbers, by geometry, by a deep and patient understanding of how the world actually works, not how we merely wish it to be. The silence of my workshop was no longer a place of mourning, it became a laboratory. The only sounds were the scratch of my charcoal on parchment and the quiet, determined turning of a new page. The silence of my workshop became a cage. I could only stare at the same walls for so long, tracing the same problems in my mind, before the need for something new became overwhelming. I had to get out of Florence. The memory of the competition hung over every street corner, every familiar face. I needed to go somewhere that held no memories for me, somewhere I could look at problems so ancient and so vast that my own small failure would shrink into proper perspective. I decided to go to Rome, and I asked my friend, the sculptor Donatello, to come with me. Donatello was everything I was not at that moment. Young, bursting with energy and talent, his future still a bright open road. He had not yet been hardened by public defeat. He saw my invitation not as a retreat but as a grand adventure, and his enthusiasm was a small antidote to my own heavy mood. We set out on foot, like pilgrims, but our pilgrimage was not to a shrine of saints, it was to a graveyard of giants. We walked the ancient roads south, through the rolling hills of Tuscany and into the wilder landscape of Lazio. The journey itself was a kind of cleansing. The rhythm of walking, the changing light, the simple focus of putting one foot in front of the other, it quieted the noise in my head. We talked of everything and nothing, the quality of the light on the fields, the techniques of different stone carvers we knew, the foolishness of patrons. For the first time in months, I was not Filippo the failed sculptor. I was just a man on a road. And then we saw it. Rome. Not the glorious capital of an empire, but a vast haunting skeleton. The first sight of it from the hills was overwhelming, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't the beauty that struck me. It was the scale of the decay. Grand temples stood roofless, open to the sky. Colossal arches, built for triumphant emperors, now served as gates for shepherds' flocks. Entire hills were made of broken pottery and crumbled brick. The Forum was a meadow growing between toppled columns. The city was a magnificent ruin, a testament to both unbelievable ambition and the relentless power of time. We found a small room to rent and began our work the very next day. Our routine became our religion. Every morning at first light we would go out into the ruins. Donatello, with his sculptor's soul, was drawn to the statues. He would spend hours sketching the broken figures of gods and heroes, studying the flow of a marble robe, the tension in a stone muscle. He was learning how to make stone feel alive. But my eyes were pulled elsewhere. I was mesmerized by the bones of the city, not its skin. I became obsessed with the structures everyone else walked past without seeing. The foundations of bridges, the supporting walls of palaces, the intricate systems of aqueducts that marched across the countryside. While Donatello looked at what was beautiful, I looked at what was strong. I looked at what had held up. I carried a rope knotted at regular intervals for measuring, a plumb bob, a wax tablet for notes, and a sharp piece of charcoal. I would spend whole days on my hands and knees in the dirt, clearing away weeds and rubble to trace the outlines of a foundation. I measured the thickness of walls, the span of arches, the precise angle of a vault. I was not an artist anymore. I was an anatomist, dissecting the corpse of a giant to learn the secrets of its strength. Our methods complemented each other perfectly. Donatello's eye for form helped him visualize the complete building from its fragments. He could look at a broken capital and imagine the entire column and the weight it was meant to bear. My mind worked in reverse. I would see the immense weight of a structure, a bath complex, a basilica, and then trace the logic backwards, down through the arches and piers and into the ground, to understand how the whole incredible mass was carried. We were two men asking the same question from opposite ends. How did they do this? The biggest puzzle, the one that consumed me, was the question of how they lifted such enormous blocks of stone. We would stand at the base of the Pantheon, looking up at its massive dome, and the question was deafening. The stones in its walls were larger than any man. How did they get them up there? There were no cranes that could lift such weight to such a height. The technology simply didn't exist in our time. The Romans had possessed a knowledge that had been utterly lost, washed away in the dark centuries after their empire fell. They had built like gods, and we had forgotten their language. This was the heart of it. This was the quiet, determined curiosity that had replaced my ambition. It wasn't enough to admire their work. I had to understand their methods. I had to reverse engineer their genius. Every day in that vast open-air library of stone I felt the pieces of my old self, the sculptor who cared about surface and form, falling away. I was becoming something else, something harder, something more patient, a solver of ancient puzzles. and the greatest puzzle of all was waiting for me back in Florence. Our days in Rome fell into a rhythm as steady and purposeful as a heartbeat. Dawn would find us already moving through the cool, quiet streets, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. We carried our simple tools, knotted ropes, plumb lines, wax tablets, like pilgrims carrying relics. But our devotion was not to saints, it was to stone and mortar and the forgotten intelligence they contained. Donatello's genius was in his eyes. He could look at a fragment of a marble frieze, at the curve of a broken horse's leg or the drape of a stone gown, and his mind would complete the picture. He would sketch furiously, capturing not just the line but the movement, the life that the sculptor had locked within the stone centuries before. He was learning the poetry of form, the language of emotion carved in marble. He saw the art. I saw the architecture. My world became one of angles and weights, of vectors and forces. While Donatello traced the flow of a toga, I was on my hands and knees, brushing dirt from the foundation of the same building, measuring how deep it went, how wide it was, calculating the load it was designed to bear. I became obsessed with the spaces between things, the span of an arch, the height of a vault, the thickness of a supporting wall. These were not empty spaces. They were decisions. They were the physical answers to questions of physics that the Roman engineers had solved. We were a perfect pair, though our focus was so different. He would pull me over to see the exquisite detail on a capital, and I would end up measuring the diameter of the column it crowned. I would drag him to examine the ingenious brickwork inside a collapsed vault, and he would marvel at the pattern, the rhythm of it, as if it were a kind of visual music. We were two men reading the same book, but he was absorbed in the beautiful prose, and I was diagramming the sentence structure. The puzzle that consumed me, the question that kept me awake at night, was the sheer mechanics of their ambition. We would stand in the colossal baths of Caracalla, surrounded by mountains of crumbled brick, and I would try to imagine it whole. The vaulted ceilings that had once soared overhead, the tons of mosaic and marble that had covered every surface, the thousands of people who had moved through these halls. The weight was unimaginable, and yet they had built it. They had not just built it, they had made it seem effortless. How did they lift those massive blocks of travertine to such heights? The stones in the foundations were larger than ox carts. The existing cranes in our time, the simple tread wheels and pulleys used in Florence, couldn't begin to manage such weight. The Romans had possessed a knowledge of machinery, of leverage and counterweight that felt almost magical in its sophistication. It was a technology that had simply vanished from the earth. We were like children staring at a locked door, knowing unimaginable treasures were on the other side, but having lost the key. So we measured everything. We measured the thickness of walls at their base versus their top, seeing how they tapered to shed weight. We measured the curve of arches, noting how the precise shape channeled the tremendous downward force outwards to the supporting piers. We measured the intervals between columns, finding the perfect maximum span before a lintel would crack under its own weight. My wax tablets filled with numbers, with rough diagrams, with questions. I wasn't just collecting data. I was learning a new way of thinking. I was learning to see the invisible forces of compression and tension that governed all structures. I was learning that building was not about piling stone upon stone. It was about creating a conversation between materials, a balance where every element supported every other, a stable equilibrium that could defy gravity itself. This was the silent, beautiful logic I had been searching for. It was a language far more profound than any law my father practiced, and I was only just beginning to understand its grammar. But the true revelation, the secret that would change everything, wasn't in the grand arches or the towering walls. It was in the stuff that held them together. It was in the mortar. One afternoon, sheltered from the rain under the broken vault of a small temple, I picked at the joint between two massive stones. The stone itself was hard, unyielding, but the material between them was crumbling, almost like a hard cheese. I broke off a piece and rolled it between my fingers. It was gritty, but it had held these stones in place for over 1,000 years. This was their magic. This was Roman concrete. Donatello watched me, amused at first, as I became obsessed with this grey, unglamorous powder. While he sought out the most beautiful statues, I started seeking out the most collapsed buildings, the piles of rubble where I could find the core of the walls, the hidden mortar that had been protected from the weather. I took samples. I tasted it. I know it sounds strange, but you can learn a lot from the grit on your tongue. I mixed it with water to see how it set. I was trying to reverse engineer a recipe lost to time. I began to see the components. It wasn't just sand and lime like our weak mortar in Florence. There was something else. A reddish, crumbly substance I found everywhere in the soil around Rome. The locals called it pozzolana. I discovered that when they mixed this volcanic ash with lime and water, something miraculous happened. It didn't just dry, it cured. It became a rock itself, and it did something even more incredible. It could set under water. This changed everything. This wasn't just glue for stones. This was a building material in its own right. I finally understood the bravery of their arches, the impossible spans of their aqueducts. They weren't just stacking stones and hoping they stayed. They were creating a monolithic, unified shell. The concrete, once set, acted as one continuous piece, distributing weight evenly, resisting cracks, bonding with the brick and stone to create something far stronger than the sum of its parts. The dome of the Pantheon, which had haunted my dreams, was not a dome of heavy stone blocks. It was a dome of this concrete, lighter, stronger, poured in layers to form a perfect, unsupported hemisphere. Standing inside that vast, echoing space, feeling the sheer audacity of it press down on me, I had the thought. The clear, sharp, life-altering thought. What if we could build like this again? Not by copying their styles, their columns and their pediments, but by understanding their principles, by using their intelligence. The gaping hole in the roof of Santa Maria del Fiore back in Florence was not a problem of art. It was a problem of engineering. And the Romans had already written the textbook. We had just forgotten how to read it. I wasn't just studying ruins anymore. I was studying a way forward. The solution to my city's greatest shame was lying in the dirt all around me, waiting for someone with the patience to see it. The journey back to Florence felt entirely different from the journey out. We walked the same road, but I was a different man. My bag was not full of souvenirs or sketches of statues. It was heavy with notebooks, each page crammed with numbers, diagrams, and the gritty grey dust of Roman mortar. The questions that had driven me to Rome had not been answered with simple facts. They had been replaced by a deeper, more profound understanding. I had gone looking for the how of their building, and I had found their why, a fearless application of logic and material against the forces of nature. The city came into view, nestled in its valley, and I saw it with completely new eyes. I didn't just see the beautiful facades of the palaces or the familiar curve of the river. I saw structure. I saw the thrust of the bridges, the load-bearing walls of the towers, the clever joinery of the wooden roofs. It was like I had learned a new language, and now I could read the hidden text of the city all around me. And my eyes were drawn, irresistibly to the one structure that dominated the skyline, the one that was silently screaming its incompleteness. Santa Maria del Fiore, the Cathedral. Its massive, unfinished walls rose like a challenge, and the gaping hole at its centre was no longer a symbol of failure to me. It was a question, and for the first time I believed I had the vocabulary to answer it. The quiet, patient curiosity that had grown in the Roman dust was now a steady, humming certainty. I was home, and I was ready to begin. But that confidence, that new vision, was quickly met with a sheer, daunting reality of the problem. Every day the cathedral was there, Santa Maria del Fiore. You could not escape it. It was the heart of the city, and its heart was a gaping, open wound. For over a century it had stood like that, a magnificent stone bowl waiting for a lid. The walls were complete, a vast octagon of heavy dark sandstone rising higher than any other building in Florence. They had built the drum, the circular base for the dome, and then they had simply stopped. They had built themselves to the edge of the impossible and then frozen there. Walking through the piazza, you could feel the collective shame of it. It was the city's greatest and most public failure. Tourists would come and stare up, not in awe but in confusion. They would ask the locals, "Why is it unfinished?" And there was no good answer. The architects who began it had been so bold in their vision, so ambitious in their scale, that they had drawn a circle on the ground that no one knew how to close in the air. They had designed a dome with a span wider than any attempted since the fall of Rome, and they had left no instructions on how to build it. The technology had been lost. The common method, the only method anyone knew, was to use enormous wooden centering, a temporary wooden framework built like a giant skeleton to support the masonry of the arch or dome until the mortar set. It was how all the smaller domes and vaults in the city had been built. But for this, the space was too wide. The height was too great. The amount of timber needed would have required stripping entire forests. The cost would have been unimaginable. And even if they could find the wood and the money, the weight of such a framework, plus the wet mortar and stone, would have been too much for the existing walls to bear. The whole thing would have collapsed inward, so for 100 years they did nothing. They held festivals in the nave, they said their prayers under the open sky, and they looked up at that empty circle of blue and accepted it as a monument to human limitation. For me, it was no longer a monument to limitation. It was a question, my question. Every day I would go and stand in the shadow of those walls. I would tilt my head back and look up, not with despair, but with my new eyes, the eyes I had trained in Rome. I wasn't seeing a problem anymore. I was seeing forces. I was calculating the downward thrust, the outward push. I was imagining the weight distribution, the strength of the materials. The Romans hadn't used wooden centering for their grandest works. They had used something else. They'd used intelligence. They'd used geometry and a superior understanding of materials to make the structure support itself. The dome itself was the support. The existing walls, the drum, became my obsession. I studied their construction, their thickness, the quality of the stone. I had to know if they were even strong enough to hold what I was beginning to imagine. I measured them. I tapped on them. I looked for cracks or weaknesses. This was the first non-negotiable part of the puzzle. However brilliant the solution for the dome might be, it would be worthless if the walls beneath it crumbled. The city's shame was a constant, quiet pressure. But for me, it had transformed. It was no longer a weight of failure. It was the tension in a bowstring, pulled back and waiting. The arrow was the idea growing in my mind, an idea built from Roman dust and a goldsmith precision. The target was the sky, and I was almost ready to let it fly. Then the call came. The Opera del Duomo, the powerful board of works overseeing the cathedral, announced a new competition. They were done waiting. They would find an architect, a master builder, anyone who could finally solve the puzzle of the dome. The announcement was posted in the public square, and the city buzzed with the news. It was the only thing anyone could talk about. After a century of failure, hope was flickering to life again. For me, the feeling was not excitement. It was a deep, cold dread that settled in my stomach. It was the baptistry doors all over again. The public forum, the judges, the other competitors, all with their models and their boasts. The memory of that earlier defeat was a fresh wound, and this felt like salt being rubbed into it. Could I really put myself through that again? Could I stand in front of the same powerful men with another radical idea and risk another very public humiliation? The safe thing, the smart thing, would be to stay away, to keep my ideas to myself, to let someone else try and fail. The fear was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest. But the dome wouldn't let me go. I would lie awake at night and see the curve of it against the sky, not as it was, but as it could be. I had walked through the ruins of Rome for a reason. I had measured their concrete and studied their arches for a purpose. This was that purpose. It wasn't about winning a competition anymore. It was about answering the question. It was about finishing the sentence the city had started 100 years ago. The fear of failure was real, but the weight of that unfinished cathedral was heavier. I had to try. I had no choice. The ghost of my younger, defeated self would just have to watch. The day of the presentation arrived. The great hall of the Opera del Duomo was filled with the most important men in Florence. Merchants, guildmasters, clerics. The air was thick with their doubt and their hope. They had seen other proposals, models of domes supported by forests of internal timber, designs for smaller, safer cupolas that betrayed the original vision. They were waiting for a miracle, but they were prepared to settle for something ordinary. I unrolled my drawings. I did not show them a beautiful painting of a finished dome. I showed them a dissection. I showed them the hidden logic. "Your Excellencies," I began, my voice quieter than the hammering of my heart. "The Romans did not build with wood. They built with stone and with mind. The solution is not to support the dome from below, but to make the dome support itself." I laid out the idea, piece by piece. A double shell. 2 thin, elegant skins of brickwork, one inside the other, separated by a hidden space. The outer shell to brave the weather, the inner shell to form the perfect interior vault, and between them, a skeleton of stone ribs connecting the two, binding them into a single, incredibly strong unit. It was like a nut within its shell, each part strengthening the other. The gasps in the room were not of awe, but of horror. They stared at the drawings as if I had shown them a fantasy creature. "No centering," one of the judges sputtered. "No wooden armature. Signore Brunelleschi, are you proposing to build an arch over 400 feet in the air on faith?" "It is not faith," I said, keeping my voice calm though my hands wanted to shake. "It is geometry. It is physics." I pointed to my diagrams, to the calculations I had made based on my months in Rome. The curve of the dome is not a simple half circle. It is a pointed arch, a more stable curve. The weight is channeled downwards more efficiently. The herringbone pattern of the bricks, each row locking into the next, will prevent the mortar from slipping while it sets. The structure will be its own support from the very first course. I explained the Roman principles, the strength of the materials, the lessons from the Pantheon. I showed them how the outward thrust of the dome would be contained by the stone chains I planned to embed within it. great belts of strength holding the entire structure in a state of perfect tension. I was not asking them to believe in me. I was asking them to believe in mathematics. I was speaking a language of force and counterforce, of compression and stability that felt as foreign to them as Greek. They listened, but their faces were masks of skepticism. I saw the same look I had seen years before at the baptistry competition. The look that said, "This is too new. This is too strange." They were practical men of business. They understood ledgers and goods and the weight of gold florins. They did not understand the invisible weight of a brick suspended in air. They wanted a solution they could see, a wooden framework they could touch, even if it was impossible to build. My proposal was all theory, a beautiful, terrifying theory drawn on parchment. I was asking them to risk the greatest project in the history of the city on an idea born from studying ruins. The silence when I finished was heavier than any stone. They did not call it genius. They called it madness. The silence broke into a storm of objections, a chorus of fear from practical men. One of the senior wool merchants stood, his face flushed. "You ask us to build a fantasy," he said, his voice thick with disbelief, "to suspend hundreds of tons of brick and stone over our most holy church on a theory. The risk is unimaginable." Another joined in, a man who had helped finance the walls decades before. "The cost of failure is not just money, it is the soul of our city. If this experiment of yours were to collapse, it would not just be a building that falls, it would be the pride of Florence." The main objection was the one I knew would come, the question that had no simple answer. "How?" the head of the committee asked, leaning forward, his fingers steepled. "Do you build an arch without support? It is a child's lesson. The mortar is wet, the bricks are loose. Without a wooden framework to hold them in place, they will slide right off the curve and plummet to the floor of the nave." "You're not describing architecture, Signore Brunelleschi. You're describing an avalanche waiting to happen." I could see the fear in their eyes. It was not a fear of me, but a fear of the unknown. They were comfortable with the old ways, even if those ways had failed for a century. A known failure felt safer than an unknown solution. The ghost of the unfinished cathedral was a familiar companion. The spectre of a collapsed one was a terror they could not face. They had already wasted so much time, so much money. To gamble what remained on my radical vision felt to them like arrogance, not insight. The trust simply wasn't there. They saw a goldsmith, a failed sculptor spinning dangerous dreams. They did not see an engineer. The weight of their doubt was a heavier burden than the stone I proposed to lift. I could see I was losing them. Their faces were closing like shutters. They understood profit and loss, not physics. I needed to make them see it, not with numbers, but with something simple, something undeniable. I needed to speak a language they all understood. "Your Excellencies," I said, cutting through the murmur of doubt, "you ask how a structure can support itself without a frame. The answer is in the shape itself. Let me show you." I reached into the pouch at my belt. The room fell silent, watching. I pulled out a simple, ordinary chicken's egg. I held it up for them all to see. A few of the men chuckled, thinking it was a joke. They expected a model, a detailed drawing, a complex machine. I gave them an egg. "The challenge," I said, my voice calm and clear in the quiet room, "is the same as the one you have given me. How do you make this stand on its end? Without support, without a frame to hold it, how do you make it defy its own nature to roll away?" I placed it gently on the polished wooden table. It wobbled and fell on its side, as everyone knew it would. Any of you could build a little cradle of wood to hold it upright, I continued, but that is the old way. That is the wooden centering you cling to. It works, but it is clumsy. It is a confession that you do not understand the object itself. The true solution is more elegant. It requires no external support because it finds its strength within its own form. I picked up the egg again. The secret is not to fight its nature, but to use it. Then, with a quick, sharp tap on the table, I crack the bottom of the egg just enough to flatten it slightly. I set it back down. It stood, perfectly upright, perfectly stable on its tiny, flattened end. A wave of murmuring went through the room. They leaned forward. It was so simple, so stupidly simple. You see, I said, my eyes scanning their astonished faces. The strength was always there. The curve of the shell is immensely strong. It just needed a precise point of contact to find its balance. The dome will be the same. The curve is the strength. The bricks laid in the correct pattern will lock together. They will support each other. The compression will flow through the structure, channeled by the shape I have designed. We will not be building a pile of bricks. We will be building a single, unified shell. The egg does not need a cradle, and my dome will not need a forest of timber. It will need only precision, intelligence, and a respect for the laws that govern all things. I left the egg standing there on the table, a small, silent testament to a very big idea. The doubt hadn't vanished from their eyes, but it was now mixed with something else. Curiosity, the first fragile spark of belief. They had seen the impossible made simple. I had given them a truth they could not argue with. It was no longer just my word against their fear. It was an egg standing on a table. That small, silent egg did more than all my drawings and calculations ever could. It made the impossible feel simple. The doubt in the room didn't vanish, but it softened. The men on the committee, these practical merchants, could understand a demonstration. They could see a result. My proposal was no longer just a frightening theory. It was a principle they had witnessed with their own eyes. The vote was not unanimous. How could it be? They were being asked to risk everything, but it was enough. They gave me the commission. The weight that settled on my shoulders in that moment was more immense than any stone in the quarry. It was the weight of the city's hope, its pride, its terrified trust. For a century, this problem had defeated every architect who dared to face it. Now, they were handing it to me. A man known more for losing a sculpture competition than for building anything. The approval was conditional, filled with warnings and scrutiny. Every florin would be watched, every decision questioned. The trust was a thin, brittle thread. I had to move from theory to practice, and the margin for error was zero. The terror was real, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was clean. This was no longer about winning a contest against another man. This was a contest against gravity itself, and I was finally allowed to step into the ring. Winning the commission was just the first brick. Now I had to find the hands that would lay all the others. This was not a job for ordinary masons. I couldn't simply hire men who knew how to build a straight wall or a simple arch. I needed a different kind of craftsman. I needed men who could follow a vision they couldn't fully see, who could trust a geometric principle more than their own lifetime of experience. I needed artists in brick, men with patience and precision in their fingers. I spent weeks visiting workshops and construction sites all across Tuscany. I wasn't just looking for strength. I was looking for intelligence in the hands. I watched how a man held his trowel, the care he took in buttering a brick, the way he checked his work with a level. I needed perfectionists. I found them in quiet corners. the men other foremen sometimes found too slow, too meticulous. They were my goldsmiths in stone. I hired carvers who could shape the special sandstone blocks for the ribs, labourers with a steady nerve for working at dizzying heights, and foremen who understood that my instructions were not suggestions, but laws of physics that could not be broken. The worksite we established was unlike anything Florence had ever seen. It wasn't just on the ground, it was in the sky. We built workshops on wooden platforms slung between the existing cathedral walls, hundreds of feet in the air. The sheer scale of the materials was staggering. Mountains of sandstone blocks, piles of specially fired bricks, barrels of mortar mixed to my exact specification. The noise was constant. The chipping of chisels, the grinding of stones, the shouted instructions echoing in the vast open space of the nave below us. Every day I walked among them, checking, measuring, explaining. I had to make them see the invisible structure I held in my mind. There was no room for error. A mistake up here wouldn't just mean starting over. It could mean collapse. The trust was a fragile thing, built day by day, brick by brick. The day arrived, bright and clear. A platform had been built high up on the drum of the cathedral, a stage set against the sky. Below in the piazza it seemed the entire city had gathered. The air hummed with a nervous energy, a mixture of hope and deep-seated fear. The clergy were there in their finest robes. The members of the Opera del Duomo stood together, their faces unreadable. I climbed the temporary stairs, my heart beating a rhythm that felt as heavy as the stones we were about to lay. This was no longer a drawing. This was the point of no return. The ceremony was brief. A blessing was spoken. Holy water was sprinkled on the massive foundation stone. The Archbishop said the words, but all I could hear was the silence of the crowd below, waiting. My hand was steady as I took the trowel and spread the first layer of mortar onto the prepared bed. The mortar was my recipe, mixed with the same care I had learned in Rome. Then, with the help of 2 masons, we lowered the first stone into place. It was a huge block of sandstone, the beginning of the first vertical rib. It settled into the mortar with a soft, final thud. The sound was swallowed by the vast space, but I felt it in my bones. In that moment, everything changed. The years of study, the defeat in Rome, the arguments with the committee, it all fell away. There was only the stone, the mortar, and the terrifying, exhilarating emptiness above it. The quiet terror of that first moment was immense. We had started. There was no turning back now. Every eye in Florence was on us, waiting to see if this impossible dream would rise or come crashing down. The weight was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was now mine to carry, one stone at a time, all the way to the clouds. The quiet terror of that first stone settled into place was quickly replaced by a much louder, more immediate problem. The ceremony was over. The crowds had dispersed. Now it was just me, my masons, and the cold, hard reality of the building itself. And the reality was this. The existing walls, the drum that was supposed to be our stable platform, were not perfect. They were a century old, built by different hands with different standards. They weren't perfectly level. They weren't perfectly strong. As we began to lay the first few courses of the foundation ring for the dome, my levels told a worrying story. There were subtle dips and rises, tiny variations that would become catastrophic, magnified over the height we needed to build. This was the first of many moments where theory met the stubborn, imperfect truth of the physical world. I couldn't just wish the walls level. I couldn't ask the stone to be stronger than it was. My beautiful geometry, my perfect curves, all of it was worthless if the base was unstable. The doubters watching from the piazza below didn't know about this problem. They were looking up, waiting for the dome to rise. I was looking down, terrified that the very ground we stood on might betray us. So we stopped. We had to. The first task was not to build up, but to reinforce. We had to create a stable, perfectly level platform on top of this imperfect century-old foundation. It was meticulous, painstaking work. We went around the entire octagon, measuring every inch. Where the wall was low, we built it up with carefully cut stone and extra thick mortar beds. Where it was weak, we added internal buttressing, hidden from view but essential for strength. We installed a system of water levels, long tubes filled with water, to find a true horizontal plane around the entire circumference. It was slow. It was expensive. The committee grumbled about the delay, about the cost of more stone. But I held firm. This was not a delay. This was the foundation of everything. You cannot build the impossible on a shaky base. Every day we spent on this unseen, unglamorous work was a day buying the certainty we would need hundreds of feet in the air. It was the first lesson in a long education of patience. The dream was in the curves above, but the truth was in the level below. But a level base was just the first of 1,000 problems. The true secret, the heart of my entire design, was not in the giant sandstone ribs. It was in the humble brick, and it was a secret I had to teach from scratch. The common way to lay bricks is in straight parallel rows. A mason lays a line of mortar, places the brick, taps it level, and moves to the next. It is a simple, strong method for a vertical wall. But for a dome, for a curve that starts almost flat and curves upward to the sky, that method was a recipe for disaster. The wet mortar would act as a lubricant. The bricks, on a steep incline, would simply slide down the curve like pebbles on a hillside. The entire structure would slough off and collapse before it even began to set. I had to invent a new way of building. I spent nights in my workshop, not with grand drawings, but with a small basket of bricks and a tub of mortar. I had to solve the problem of gravity on a curve. The answer came from the herringbone pattern I had seen in some ancient Roman walls. Instead of laying the bricks in straight lines, I designed a system where they would be laid in a spiral. Each brick would be set at a slight angle, leaning against its neighbour, each one locking the next into place. It was like weaving a basket. The weight of each new brick would push inward and downward, compressing the course below it, making the whole layer stronger and more stable. The structure would literally build its own support as it grew. But the pattern was only part of it. Each brick had to be special. They couldn't be the standard rectangular bricks used for house walls. I designed them to be tapered, slightly wedge-shaped, so that when laid in the curved pattern, the outer edge of the dome would be tight and seamless. I became a tyrant of precision. I visited the brick kilns myself, inspecting every firing. I had templates made for the bricklayers. A mason would hold up a brick and I would check its angle against the template. If it was off by even a fraction, it was rejected. The men grumbled at first. They had built walls their whole lives. Who was I to tell them their craft was wrong? I had to show them brick by brick how this new language worked. I had to make them see that we weren't just stacking clay. We were weaving a massive permanent fabric of stone. Every brick was a word in a sentence, and a single misspelled word could make the whole story collapse. It was a painstaking, slow education, but slowly they began to see it. They watched as the first few courses of the spiral held firm, defying the steepening angle. Their doubt turned to a careful, focused concentration. They were no longer just masons. They were weavers of an impossible basket, and each one of them held the entire structure in their hands. But a level base and perfectly angled bricks were just promises on paper. The true test was the air itself. We began the slow, painstaking ascent, building the first vertical tier of the dome. Each course of bricks felt like a prayer. The masons worked with a new kind of focus, their movements careful and deliberate, their eyes constantly checking the lines I'd strung to guide the curve. The herringbone pattern, which had seemed so strange on the ground, began to make sense in their hands. They could feel the lock of each brick against its neighbour, the subtle way the weight settled inward, compressing the layer below instead of sliding off. From the piazza below, the progress was invisible. We were building the very bottom of the curve, so the rise was agonizingly slow. The doubters who gathered every day to watch would shake their heads. They saw no dramatic arc against the sky, just a slightly thicker rim on top of the existing wall. They were waiting for a spectacle, for failure or triumph. They didn't understand that the spectacle was in the precision, in the millimetre-perfect placement of each and every brick. They couldn't see the silent, incredible fact that it was holding. There was no wooden skeleton. There was just brick, mortar and geometry, defying gravity one careful course at a time. For us on the work site, that was the only thing that mattered. Every evening as the sun set and we laid down our tools, the structure was still standing. There was no ominous creak, no hairline crack. The design was working. The fear in the mason's eyes, which had been so palpable on that first day, began to be replaced by a dawning confidence. They were part of something that had never been done before, and they could feel the truth of it in the trowels in their hands. We weren't just building a roof, we were building proof. The first few courses were a triumph of patience and precision, but they were built with muscle and pulley. Men hauled the bricks and mortar up in baskets, their muscles straining against the ropes. It was hard, slow, dangerous work. But as the curve began to steepen, as the height increased, a new problem emerged that threatened to stop us completely. The real challenge wasn't the bricks for the skin of the dome, it was the ribs. The sandstone ribs were the bones of my design, the hidden skeleton that would connect the inner and outer shells and give the whole structure its incredible strength. But these were not bricks. These were monsters. Each block weighed hundreds of pounds. Some were as large as a man. Getting them up to the work site, now dozens of feet in the air, was impossible with the simple hoists we had. The men couldn't lift them. The ropes would snap. The pulleys would shatter. We were building a machine of stone, and now we needed a machine of wood and iron to build it. I had to invent a solution. I spent weeks on the scaffolding, watching the men struggle, calculating weights and angles in my head. I remembered the Roman puzzles, the massive stones they had lifted to impossible heights. They had machines. I had to design one. I disappeared into my workshop, surrounded not by architectural drawings, but by models of gears and winches. The answer wasn't brute force, it was mechanical advantage. The machine I designed was unlike anything Florence had ever seen. I called it the Ox Hoist. It was a masterpiece of engineering in its own right. A massive wooden frame held a system of gears, enormous cogwheels, precisely carved from oak. The key was a reversible gear, one set of gears for lifting tremendous weight with slow, controlled power. A different gear for lowering the empty hook back down with speed to save time. And the power? Not men. Oxen. I designed a huge treadmill, a wooden wheel like a giant squirrel cage, where a team of oxen would walk endlessly forward, their steady, patient power transferred through the gears to the central winch. The real genius, though, was the safety. I designed a clutch system, a way to disengage the gears instantly if a rope snapped or a weight shifted unexpectedly, the oxen could be stopped in a heartbeat, preventing a catastrophic drop. I even designed an automatic brake, a clever wooden pawl that would catch the gear teeth if the winch tried to spin backwards, holding the load safely in place. This wasn't just a hoist, it was a thinking machine. It anticipated problems. It respected the terrible power of the weights we were lifting. Building the hoist itself became a project almost as complex as the dome. Master carpenters and blacksmiths worked for months on its parts. The day we assembled it at the base of the cathedral was a spectacle. The great wooden frame rose against the stone walls. The oxen were led into the treadmill. A sense of awe fell over the worksite. This was no longer just a construction project. It was a demonstration of a new kind of power. But the hoist solved only one problem. The cathedral floor was hundreds of feet below us now. We were building in the sky, and the worksite itself had to become a world apart. This was not a project you could simply walk away from at the end of the day. The climb up and down the rickety ladders and scaffolding was long, exhausting and dangerous. Every minute spent descending was a minute lost from the short winter days, so we stopped descending. We built a small village on the growing curve of the dome itself. We constructed wooden huts and shelters on the wide stone ledges, tucked against the inner shell for protection from the wind. The masons, the carvers, the labourers, we all slept up there. We cooked our meals on small braziers, the smell of wood smoke and stew mixing with the constant scent of wet mortar and stone dust. Our world narrowed to this single soaring purpose. The city of Florence became a map far below, its noises a faint murmur, its daily life a distant dream. Up here there was only the next brick, the next stone, the next careful measurement. The wind was our constant companion, sometimes a gentle push, sometimes a howling force that threatened to tear our shelters away and send us spinning into the abyss. We learned to read its moods, to tie down our tools, to move with a careful balance that became second nature. We were no longer builders on a site. We were sailors on a ship of stone sailing into a sea of sky, and every day we built the very deck beneath our feet. The rhythm of our skybound world was a fragile thing, built on precision and quiet confidence. We'd grown accustomed to the wind, to the dizzying height, to the slow, steady climb of the brickwork. The herringbone pattern was holding. The ox hoist was a miracle of efficiency. The curve of the dome was becoming a real thing, a graceful arc slowly eating up the empty blue. We had faced 100 small problems and solved them. We began to feel, perhaps foolishly, that we had mastered the impossible. Then we saw the crack. It was on the southern side, a hairline fracture in the masonry of the drum, the great supporting wall we'd worked so hard to reinforce. At first, it was nothing. A flaw in the stone, perhaps, a trick of the light. But over the next few days it grew. It wasn't a dramatic split, not a tearing apart. It was a slow, insistent opening, a dark line creeping upward like a vine. It was a whisper of failure, and on a worksite hundreds of feet in the air, a whisper is all it takes to create a panic. The news spread through our aerial village like a cold wind. The masons would stop their work to go and look, their faces grim. The confident chatter of the worksite fell silent, replaced by worried murmurs and stolen glances in my direction. I could see the fear in their eyes, the old fear, the fear that the doubters on the ground had been right all along, that this was all a beautiful, arrogant dream that was beginning to fracture under its own impossible weight. The crack was not just in the stone, it was in our certainty. For me, the fear was a cold knot in my stomach, colder than any winter wind at this height. This was the moment I had dreaded. This was where theory met the stubborn, unpredictable reality of materials and existing construction. I spent hours at the site of the crack on my hands and knees, tracing its path, measuring its width, trying to listen to what it was telling us. The terror was not that the dome would suddenly collapse. The terror was subtler. It was the terror of a flaw in the logic, a miscalculation so fundamental that it would force us to stop, to admit defeat, to look down at the city and know that the crack in the stone was nothing compared to the crack in our hope. Nights were the worst. Lying in my hut, listening to the wind moan through the scaffolding, I would run the calculations again and again in my mind. The weight distribution, the thrust vectors, the quality of the mortar, the strength of the 100-year-old wall. Had I missed something? Had the Romans faced this? Was there a secret they took to their graves? The silence of the night was filled with the phantom sound of crumbling mortar. This was no longer a puzzle from a notebook. This was a real, physical threat, and the price of being wrong was not a lost competition. It was lives. It was the soul of Florence. The crack was a question, and I had to find the answer before the whole question fell apart. The crack was a silent scream from the stone itself, a message of stress I had to learn to read. It wasn't a sign of collapse, but of strain. The outward thrust of the dome, the immense push against the supporting drum, was greater than I had calculated. The century-old walls were complaining under the new unprecedented load. My beautiful geometry was perfect in the air, but it was meeting the imperfect, stubborn reality of the ground. I couldn't change the physics. I had to work with them. I had to give the stone a way to help itself. The answer came to me not from my Roman notebooks, but from looking at a barrel. A simple wooden barrel bound by iron hoops. The staves want to bulge outward from the pressure of the liquid inside, but the hoops cinch them together, containing that force. The dome was doing the same thing. It was trying to push its supporting walls outward. I needed a hoop, a giant unbreakable stone and iron chain to gird the entire structure, to absorb that outward thrust and keep the walls compressed inward. Designing it was one thing. Getting the committee to approve it was another battle. They saw only more cost, more delay, more of my unproven ideas. "You want to build a giant stone belt?" one of them scoffed. "The structure is already standing." This is a solution in search of a problem. I had to make them see the crack not as a flaw, but as a warning. I had to explain the principle of tension and compression in terms they could understand. I told them the barrel story. I showed them how a chain, pulled tight, could hold incredible weight by distributing the force. This wasn't a repair. It was an essential part of the design, a feature we'd always needed. The relief when they finally, reluctantly agreed was immense, but the real relief came weeks later as the massive blocks of sandstone linked with iron cramps were set into a continuous ring within the thickness of the dome's base. The masons watched the crack closely. As the chain was tightened, as the great winches pulled the massive stones into a perfect unbroken circle, the crack stopped growing. It stabilized. It didn't disappear. It would always be a scar, a reminder of the stress we'd overcome, but it became static, held. The structure had found its balance. The silent scream had been answered. We had listened to the stone, and we had given it the strength it needed to hold us all up. The fear that had gripped the worksite began to loosen its hold. We had faced the first true crisis, and we had not been broken. We had adapted, we had learned, and we continued to build. The space between the two shells became its own hidden world, a secret place of shadows and echoes. It was not empty air. It was a labyrinth of stone that I designed, a twisting, turning passage that was both a structural necessity and a thing of strange beauty. We built spiral staircases there, corkscrewing their way up through the darkness between the inner and outer walls. They were not for grand processions. They were for the keepers of the dome, for the men who would one day make repairs, who would need to inspect the ribs, who would ensure this great stone vessel remained sound for centuries. The masons who built them worked by lamplight, their hammers tapping in the confined space, a sound that was swallowed by the immense mass of brick around them. It was eerie work, building a staircase to nowhere, a path that existed only for the maintenance of the path itself. But I knew that a building this grand was not a single act of creation. It was a promise to the future. It needed a way to be cared for, to be understood by those who would come long after we were gone. The staircase was that promise, carved in stone, hidden in the heart of the impossible. From our perch in the sky, the city below was a living map. We could see everything, the slow flow of people through the piazzas, the tiny carts crossing the Ponte Vecchio, the laundry hanging from windows. But the most fascinating thing to watch was how they watched us. At first, their gazes were filled with doubt. They would stop in the square, crane their necks and point. We were too far up to hear their words, but we could guess them. They were waiting for the collapse. They were waiting for the arrogance of our project to come crashing down in a cloud of dust and failure. But as the months turned into years, something in their posture began to change. The pointing didn't stop, but the shaking of heads did. The slow, steady, undeniable rise of the curve worked a kind of magic on them. It was no longer a question. It was becoming a fact of their daily lives. They would pass by on their way to market and simply glance up, a quick check on our progress, the way you might glance at a familiar clock tower. The dome was weaving itself into the rhythm of the city. Children were born who had never known a Florence without that graceful arc growing against the sky. The structure was no longer just a building site, it was becoming a part of them, a source of a quiet, dawning pride that replaced the old, century-old shame. They didn't understand the herringbone pattern, or the principle of the stone chain. They didn't need to. They could see the truth with their own eyes. The impossible was being built, brick by patient brick, and they were there to witness it. The stone and the sky became my entire world. The slow, patient rise of the dome, the rhythm of the Ox Hoist, the precise placement of each brick, this was the only language I spoke. The city below, with its worries and its politics, felt like a distant dream. But life has a way of pulling you back to earth. A messenger climbed the long, treacherous ladders to our work site in the sky, his face grim. My father was dying. The news was like a crack appearing in a different kind of foundation. I left the site immediately, the familiar sounds of chisels and men fading behind me as I descended into the streets of the city I'd almost forgotten. The walk to my family home was through a world that had continued without me. People went about their business, buying bread, arguing in the square, completely unaware that my own world was shifting on its axis. I found him in his bed, surrounded by the smell of old parchment and medicine. The man who had wanted me to be a notary, a man of words and laws, was now reduced to silence. His hands, which had once penned so many legal documents, were still on the coverlet. The arguments we had about my future, the disappointment he felt when I chose the workshop over the study, all of it felt so small and far away now. We had spoken different languages, my father and I. His was of precedent and contract. Mine was of force and form. We had never found a way to translate. Sitting there, in the quiet of that room, the immense weight of the dome felt like a physical pressure on my chest. The hundreds of men waiting for my instructions, the tons of stone suspended in the air, the terrified trust of the entire city. It all demanded my focus, my every waking thought. And yet here was this simpler, more profound duty, the duty of a son. There was no geometry for this, no herringbone pattern to lock the pieces of grief into place. It was just a quiet, aching absence. His passing was not sudden or dramatic. It was a slow fading, like a light diminishing in a room. And when he was gone, the silence he left behind was a new kind of architecture. It was the architecture of memory and legacy. He had wanted me to build a different kind of monument, a reputation, a family name upheld in the courts. I had built machines of wood and iron instead. I had chosen to speak to stone. Standing by his grave, I wondered if he had ever understood that my need to build was not a rejection of his world, but a search for a different kind of truth, a truth that was not written on parchment, but embodied in brick and mortar. The dome was no longer just a civic project. It became something else, a testament, a legacy not of a family name, but of a stubborn, persistent will to create something that would outlast all of us. The grief was a heavy thing, but I carried it back up the ladders with me. There was no time to stop. The work was the only prayer I knew how to say. The dome was a hungry beast and its appetite was endless. Stone, brick, mortar, timber for the machines. The sheer volume of material we consumed was a logistical nightmare that never eased. The beautiful curve growing against the sky was built on a much less beautiful foundation. The quarries of Tuscany, the brick kilns on the outskirts of the city, and the muddy banks of the Arno River. The sandstone for the massive ribs came from the quarries at Trasinaya, a day's journey away. Each block was a special order, cut to my exact specifications for its place in the great stone chain or the vertical ribs. The quarry masters would send messages, their tone increasingly desperate. "The vein is running thin, maestro," or "the next block of that size will require blasting a new face on the mountain." Every delay there meant men and oxen standing idle on the work site, their eyes turned toward the empty road. The bricks were a different kind of headache. My special tapered bricks, the key to the herringbone pattern, couldn't be made by just any brickyard. I had to train the kiln masters, provide them with wooden templates, and then personally inspect every firing. A batch that was too brittle would shatter under the weight. A batch fired too soft would crumble. We weren't building a farmhouse. We were building an equation where every variable had to be perfect. The good Tuscan clay was a finite resource, and we were consuming it at a rate that terrified the men who supplied the city's everyday construction. And then there was the problem of moving it all. Carting thousands of tons of stone and brick overland was slow, expensive, and tore up the roads. The answer was the river. But the existing barges were too small, too unstable for our heaviest loads. So I designed a new one, a barge with a wider, flatter hull nicknamed Il Badalone, the monster. It was another one of my machines built for the single purpose of feeding the beast on the hill. Watching the first load of sandstone blocks being carefully lowered onto its deck, seeing the waterline rise perilously close to the gunnels, was its own kind of terror. A snapped cable, a sudden squall on the river, and a month's worth of stone would be at the bottom of the Arno. The dome was not just built in the sky. It was built on a fragile, endless chain of supply that stretched across the entire countryside, and every link in that chain had to hold. We had conquered the sky, but we could not conquer the rain. As the dome curved ever upward, closing the great oculus, it created a new problem. A giant stone bowl open to the heavens. The autumn storms would roll in over the Tuscan hills, and the sky would release its torrent. The water would cascade down the inner curve of the dome, collecting in a growing, swirling lake on the wooden platform that sealed the work in progress. It was a nightmare. The water undermined the new mortar, weakening the freshly laid bricks. It warped the precious timber of our platforms and hoisting machines. It turned our worksite into a cold, slippery, dangerous bog hundreds of feet in the air. I couldn't stop the rain, so I had to outthink it. The water needed a path, a way to escape. I designed a drainage system hidden within the very fabric of the dome itself. We carved small, clever channels into the surface of the inner shell, disguised within the brickwork. These weren't just ditches. They were a network of tiny rivers, all gently sloped to guide the water towards strategically placed spouts that jutted out through the outer shell. From the city below, these spouts looked like decorative elements, but for us they were a lifesaver. They became gargoyles with a purpose, spewing the collected rainwater harmlessly out into the open air, away from the fragile mortar and our vital machinery. It was a constant battle, a quiet war against the elements fought with chisels and careful slopes. Every time the heavens opened, we would watch, not with dread, but with a critical eye, checking the flow, making sure our hidden arteries were carrying the lifeblood of the storm away from the heart of our work. Just when the rhythm of the dome felt settled, when the great curve was nearly closed and the end felt within our grasp, the city announced another competition. The Opera del Duomo, unable to let a single moment pass without a contest, called for designs to crown my dome with a lantern, the marble tribute that would sit at the very top, the final piece. And of course they invited all comers. The old sting of the baptistry doors came rushing back. The endless climb, the years of solving impossible problems, the very sky itself tamed. None of it seemed to matter. They wanted to see models and hear speeches all over again. And I knew who would be there, ready with his smooth talk and beautiful drawings. Lorenzo Ghiberti. The frustration was a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. Had I not proven myself? Had the dome itself, standing proudly against all doubt, not been testimony enough? To have to stand before another committee to justify my vision for the one piece that would complete my own work felt like a profound insult. It was as if a painter, having nearly finished a masterpiece, was told he must audition to add the final brush stroke. The old fear of public judgment returned, but this time it was mixed with a weary anger. I had spent years in the sky, my hands calloused from stone, my mind bent on physics, while others plotted in comfortable rooms below. Now they wanted to judge the crown without having borne the weight of the head that would wear it. The work was its own argument, its own proof, but once again I would have to make that argument with words and wax models to men who had never felt a stone's true weight. The frustration of the competition was fire, but I knew I couldn't fight them with anger. I had to win them with an idea so perfect, so undeniably right, that even a committee couldn't deny it. The lantern wasn't just a decoration. It wasn't a trophy to be placed on top. In my mind, it was the final, crucial piece of the engineering puzzle. The dome was complete, but it was not yet finished. The final stones at the top, the oculus, were held in a delicate balance. The weight of the lantern, if designed correctly, would be the final lock. It would press down on the apex, compressing the entire structure, binding the ribs and the two shells together with an immovable force. It was the keystone of a cathedral-sized arch. So my design was not about beauty, though it would be beautiful. It was about physics. I designed it as an octagon, mirroring the drum below. It would be light, almost delicate looking, built of the same white marble from Carrara, but its elegance hid a brutal purpose. Its weight was meticulously calculated, heavy enough to provide the essential compression, but not so heavy as to overstress the point it was meant to protect. Every line, every column, every window was there for a reason. To channel weight, to resist wind, to be the perfect permanent capstone. It was the final word in a sentence I'd started writing over a decade before. It was not an add-on. It was the period at the end of the paragraph. To see it as anything else was to misunderstand everything we had built. The models were displayed. Ghiberti's was beautiful, of course. Elegant, ornate, a delicate marble confection that looked like it belonged in a prince's garden. It spoke the language the committee understood, the language of decoration, of prestige. Mine was different. I showed them the bones. I showed them the hidden weights, the distribution of load, the way my lantern would complete the compression of the dome, acting as the final permanent keystone. I didn't talk about beauty. I talked about force. I talked about permanence. I showed them how their beautiful lantern, if it were not also an engine of stability, would be a capstone for a generation, until the first strong wind or settling crack made it a monument to a second failure. The vote, once again, was not unanimous, but it was enough. The satisfaction was not the sweet triumph of beating a rival. It was the grim satisfaction of being heard, of having the truth of the work recognised, even reluctantly. They handed me the burden of the lantern, the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. The vindication was a quiet thing. Felt alone on the scaffolding later that day, looking up at the empty space where my design would now go. The burden was heavier than any stone because this was the very last thing. The final signature on a project that had consumed my life. There would be no more chances after this. The day the two sides of the dome finally met was not marked by a grand ceremony or a city-wide holiday. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where the Tuscan light turns everything to gold. The final stone, a simple, perfectly shaped brick, was set into place at the very apex. The mason looked at me, his trowel hovering, and I gave a single, slow nod. He pressed it into the mortar bed. The last sliver of open sky vanished. The circle was closed. A profound silence fell over the worksite. The constant tap-tap-tapping of hammers had stopped. The groan of the Ox Hoist was still. There was only the wind, whistling softly over the smooth, continuous curve that now soared above Florence. The masons stood on the scaffolding, their faces lifted to the sky, not cheering, but simply staring. They looked as if they couldn't believe what their own hands had done. The fear, the doubt, the years of back-breaking labour. It all condensed into that one silent moment of pure, undiluted awe. We had done it. We had actually done it. The impossible was no longer a theory. It was a fact of stone and brick, arcing triumphantly against the blue. The cheers from the city below came later, a distant rising wave of sound that we felt more than heard, a vibration that travelled up through the very stones we stood on. It was a sound that went straight to the bone, a confirmation from the people we had built it for. The open wound in the heart of Florence was healed. The sky had a roof. The cheers from the city below were a distant hum, a sound that belonged to another world. Up here, there was only the wind and the stone. After the last mason had climbed down, after the tools had been gathered and the hoist stilled, I remained. I needed a moment alone with the thing we had made. Climbing the final internal staircase to the very apex was like entering a different element. The air was thinner, sharper. The wooden platform at the top was small, a tiny island in a sea of sky. And then I stepped out onto the very crown of the dome, onto the temporary platform where the lantern would one day stand. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It was a profound, ringing quiet, broken only by the whisper of the wind sliding over the marble and brick. I looked down. Florence was laid out below me like a child's toy. The red-tiled rooftops were a textured carpet. The Arno River was a thin silver ribbon. The people in the piazza were smaller than ants, their lives reduced to tiny silent movements. I could see the entire history of the city from that spot. The old Roman grid, the medieval towers, the new palaces being built. It was all there, a map of human ambition laid bare. But it was the horizon that truly stole my breath. I could see for miles. The green hills of Tuscany rolled away into a soft blue haze. I could see the other towns, Fiesole on its hill, the distant smudge of Siena. The world felt immense, and our little city, for all its pride, was just a small part of it. All the arguments, the competitions, the politics, it all seemed so small from up here. The doubters, the rivals, the sceptical committee members, their voices were lost in this vast, silent perspective. I stood there for a long time until the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The shadow of the dome stretched across the city, a long, dark finger pointing east. There was no triumph in that moment, no shouting victory. There was only a deep, quiet humility. We had reached for the sky, and our hands had somehow touched it, but the sky remained, vast and indifferent. We had built something magnificent, but we had not conquered anything. We had simply added our small, beautiful sentence to the long, silent story of the world. The achievement was not in dominating the horizon, but in having taken my place upon it, a tiny figure on a great stone curve feeling the immense gentle pressure of the sky. With the outer shell complete and the sky sealed out, our work turned inward. The inner shell, the one that would create the vast echoing space for worship, was a different kind of challenge. It wasn't about defying the weather or proving a point to doubters. It was about creating beauty and perfect acoustics for those who would stand below. This was the dome they would actually experience, the ceiling of their prayers. We built it with a smoother curve, a more refined finish, knowing every detail would be scrutinized from the cathedral floor. The brickwork had to be flawless, the lines precise. We worked by the light of oil lamps, our shadows dancing on the growing vault above us, checking and rechecking the curvature that would one day hold magnificent frescoes. The space began to take on a life of its own, amplifying the slightest sound, a dropped tool, a whispered instruction, into a ghostly echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a reminder that we weren't just building structure. We were building an experience, a sacred space that would awe and inspire long after the memory of how it was built had faded. The inner vault was the soul of the dome, and we treated every brick with the reverence it deserved. The quiet satisfaction of the nearly finished dome was a fragile thing, easily broken by the voices from below. As the last bricks were set and the great curve stood complete against the sky, the critics found their voice once more. Lorenzo Ghiberti, who had been given a share of the credit for my work by the political manoeuvring of the Opera del Duomo, never missed a chance to whisper in important ears. He would stand in the piazza, pointing up at some minor detail, suggesting a different approach would have been better, questioning the long-term stability to anyone who would listen. His words were like small, sharp stones, individually insignificant, but together they could wear you down. Other architects, men who had proposed safer, smaller solutions, joined the chorus. They called the dome a reckless gamble, a beautiful folly that would surely develop problems in the coming years. They whispered that the herringbone pattern was a novelty, that the hidden stone chains were a sign of weakness, not strength. They couldn't see the intelligence in the design. They could only see that it was not their own. The political games were the hardest to bear. Powerful families with connections to the stone quarries or the brickmakers would lobby for their interests, trying to influence decisions about the final details, the lantern, the decoration. They saw the dome not as a triumph of human spirit, but as a source of patronage and profit. I had to defend the work constantly, not with grand speeches, but with facts and figures. I would meet with the committees and explain for the 100th time why the curve was stable, why the materials were sound. It was exhausting. After years of battling gravity, I now had to battle human nature, the envy, the pride, the small-mindedness that couldn't comprehend something truly new. The dome itself was a silent, perfect argument, but it seemed I would always need to be its translator for those who preferred the comfort of doubt to the challenge of wonder. The work had been hard, but the politics of its acceptance was a different kind of labour, and it required a patience I often did not feel. The day they finally came up was the true test, not of the structure, but of the spirit. The committee, the patrons, the powerful men who had doubted and funded and doubted again, they were to make the climb. I led them, my hand on the cool stone of the internal staircase, their nervous breaths echoing in the narrow passage. With every step, the world of Florence fell away, replaced by the intimate, dusty reality of the dome's hidden heart. You could feel the immensity of the space around you, the sheer weight of the accomplishment pressing in. When we emerged onto the interior gallery, the sound that escaped them was not a word but a gasp, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the air from the vast vault. They stood there, these men of ledgers and laws, their mouths agape, their heads craned back to take in the incredible sweep of the inner shell soaring above them. They were used to power measured in gold florins and political favours. This was a different kind of power. This was the power of space, of light, of form made monumental. One of them, a wealthy wool merchant who had been among my most vocal skeptics, reached out and placed his palm flat against the brickwork. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, feeling the cool, solid permanence of it. The arguments, the cost overruns, the endless meetings. It all vanished in that simple touch. He was feeling the truth. Not my truth, but the truth of the thing itself. The dome required no defence. It was its own argument. I watched their faces as they looked out through the windows at the view they had only ever seen from the ground. Their city was laid out like a map they thought they owned, but from here they saw it anew. They saw the patterns of the streets, the flow of the river, the humble scale of their own palazzos. The awe in their eyes was the final silent approval. There were no more questions about stability, no whispers of doubt about the methods. There was only the humbling, magnificent presence of the impossible made real. They had come up as critics and committee members. They went down as witnesses, and in their silent acceptance, I knew the work was truly done. It was never just a roof. From the very first moment I conceived of it, I knew it had to be more. A dome is a simple thing, a curve that encloses space. But this dome, this was different. It had to be a symbol, a statement carved in stone against the Tuscan sky that Florence, our city of merchants and artists, could rival the grandeur of ancient Rome. We were no longer living in the shadow of giants. We were becoming giants ourselves. For me, it was the culmination of everything. The boy tracing lines in the dust, the goldsmith learning precision, the defeated artist studying ruins. Every failure, every lesson, every moment of doubt had been preparation for this single, magnificent purpose. The dome is my life's work, but it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who looks up and feels that stirring in their chest, that sense that humanity is capable of more than we dare to imagine. It is proof that will and imagination can reshape the world. It stands as a testament to a simple, powerful idea that the greatest limitations are not in our materials or our tools, but in our minds. We're only bound by what we believe is impossible. The dome asks a question of everyone who sees it. What is your impossible? And then it whispers the answer in the silent language of stone. Look what can be done. The dome was not an end, it was a beginning. As the last stones of the lantern were set and the final inspections concluded, I realized the true product of these decades was not just the structure itself, but the knowledge we had forged in building it. I had not simply constructed a dome, I had built a school. The masons, the carvers, the labourers, these men had learned a new language of building. They had felt the truth of the herringbone pattern in their hands, understood the necessity of perfect angles, and witnessed the power of mechanical advantage. They carried this knowledge out from the work site and into the city, into new projects across Tuscany. They became masters themselves, teaching the next generation the principles of stability and precision we had proven in the sky. The machines we invented, particularly the great Ox Hoist with its revolutionary gears and safety mechanisms, became blueprints for the future. Other architects studied them, copied them, adapted them for bridges and fortifications, the methods for moving massive weights, for calculating thrust and compression, for building without centering. These were no longer lost Roman secrets. They were now part of our living tradition, a practical education written not in books but in wood and iron and stone. The dome itself was the greatest lesson, a permanent, silent teacher in the sky for anyone who cared to look up and understand. It taught that to build on a grand scale, you must first think on a grand scale. You must see the invisible forces and have the courage to converse with them. The work created a new kind of builder, one who was part artist, part mathematician, and entirely an engineer. The legacy was not in the glory of the finished thing, but in the quiet confidence that now lived in the hands and minds of the men who had built it. They knew, as I knew, that the impossible was only a word for a problem we hadn't solved yet. The dome is my life signature etched against the sky, but I must confess it is a signature written at a great cost. The city sees the glorious curve, the perfect white marble, the triumph. They do not see the price. They do not see the years that vanished into that single all-consuming purpose. My life narrowed to the circumference of that stone drum. My world shrank to the next brick, the next calculation, the next problem to solve. There was no room for anything else. Friendships faded into the mist of memory, their invitations to supper or to walk in the hills going unanswered for so long that they eventually stopped coming. A life outside the worksite became a distant rumour. The man who loved conversation, who enjoyed the company of other artists and thinkers, slowly became a recluse on a platform in the clouds, his only companions the masons and the wind. My health, too, paid a toll. The constant exposure to the elements, the bone-deep fatigue of a mind forever solving equations of weight and force, the endless anxiety that lived like a cold stone in my stomach. These things wear a man down. I aged decades in those years, my body becoming as weathered as the stone I worked with. And the personal sacrifices, they are the quietest, most painful ones. There was a woman once, a possibility of a family, a home filled with something other than architectural drawings. But the dome was a jealous master. It demanded everything. It allowed for no other loves and no other devotions. The choice was not really a choice at all. The work was a force of nature, and I was simply caught in its path. I sometimes wonder about that other life, the one lived on the ground, filled with ordinary joys and sorrows. But then I look up, and I see the curve of the dome against the blue, and I know the answer to the question that has haunted me. Was it worth the sacrifice? The dome does not answer. It simply stands, and in its silent, permanent presence, I find my reply. The final inspection was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of its creation. The committee walked the interior gallery one last time, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. They carried not hope or fear anymore, but simple checklists. They tapped walls with small hammers, not to test for hollow sounds of weakness, but to confirm the solid, reassuring thud of perfection. They measured the curve of the vault with long calibrated rods, and every measurement confirmed what their eyes could already see. There were no speeches, no grand pronouncements. The work was its own testament. The official document they presented to me was brief, a simple declaration that the work was complete, sound, and in accordance with the commission. The final payment, a large chest of gold florins, felt insignificant. The real reward was in their silent acceptance, in the way they simply stopped questioning. The decades of doubt were over, filed away with the official paperwork. The burden was lifted. I was no longer the man building the impossible. I was simply the man who had built it. So what does it take to build the impossible? It takes a boy who would rather hold a chisel than a quill. It takes the sting of a very public defeat to teach you that resilience is more valuable than early success. It takes a quiet, patient curiosity that sends you walking through ancient ruins, looking for answers everyone else has forgotten. And it takes a lifetime of dedication to a single magnificent purpose, a willingness to let that purpose consume your days and define your nights. The impossible is not a wall, it is a door, and the key is simply the stubborn, persistent will to try the lock again and again until it finally turns. If you found strength in this story of quiet persistence, there are more tales of impossible things made real on this channel. Subscribe and let's continue this conversation under the vast, generous sky.